Hey, welcome back. This video is part 2 of the first video on my channel. Just in case you haven't seen it, I'll try to sum it up quickly. The Tichbornes were a wealthy noble family who had been in England since the days of William the Conqueror. In 1854, Roger Tichborne, who was the heir to the family's fortune, went missing after a shipwreck in Brazil. 11 years later, a man named Thomas Castro appeared and claimed to be Roger, and if he could prove his claims, he would gain control of the family's wealth. Obviously, everyone in the family hated him and thought it was a scam, except for Roger's mother, who immediately bought his story and supported his claim. So when we left off, it was sometime in 1867, and his doubters were trying to prove that he was an imposter. So in July of the same year, our claimant was called to a court exam to officially give his story for the first time. He said he showed up in Melbourne in 1854 and started working on a cattle farm where he met another Englishman named Arthur Orton. A few years later, he left his job to go be homeless, I guess, before eventually moving to Wagga Wagga to become a butcher. After the court exam, the family had new info to expose Castro with, so they sent a solicitor to Australia to investigate. He managed to locate the wife of the cattle farm's owner, and she showed him the farm's records, which had Orton listed, but not Castro. The solicitor also showed her a recent photo of the claimant, and she said his photo matched an old one of Arthur Orton. The family now had real suspicions that the claimant could actually be Orton, so they hired a PI named Jack Witcher to investigate his backstory. It took him a couple years of digging, but Witcher discovered Castro's earlier visit to the Ortons' neighborhood. He also learned that Orton's father was a butcher and that he had sent his son off to Australia when he was 14. The family now had even more evidence linking Castro and Orton through their backstories, and also testimony from Orton's neighbor about that dumb visit he made earlier. The new information was made public by the family, so now the claimant had to prove that he was Roger Tichborne, but also not Arthur Orton. Now, even though it's getting harder to prove his claims, his public support kept increasing. The working class saw him as one of their own being screwed out of his inheritance by the upper class, and most people didn't even care if he was who he said he was. They just wanted him to get his bag. So before we move on, we gotta talk about another reason why this case was so popular. The Tichborne Curse. The family had a 600-year-long tradition of handing out food to the poor each year, and apparently a curse would destroy the family if anyone ever broke the tradition. So back in the 1100s, the wife of Roger Tichborne, Lady Marbella, was dying from disease. So she asked her husband to honor her passing by donating food to the poor each year. I guess Roger hated his wife or something, because in response, he grabbed a burning log from the fireplace, handed it to his dying wife, and told her he'll donate only from an area she can crawl around before the log burns out. Out of spite for her husband, which, in this case is completely understandable, Lady Marbella dragged herself around 23 acres of farmland and placed a curse on the family before dying. Her curse said,
"If the event is ever stopped, the family shall see a generation of 7 sons, followed by one of 7 daughters, and then the family name shall die out."
Fast forward almost 600 years to 1796 when it was cancelled for the first time because too many vagrants were showing up for the handouts. Now, I think it's kind of weird to donate to the poor for 600 years straight and then get upset when a lot of poor people start showing up, but apparently this wasn't your average poor person. These people were going bananas. Anyways, 25 years after the cancellation, Henry Tichborne, who was the oldest of 7 sons, succeeded to the title. He then gave birth to 7 daughters, so the family was terrified. They put the event back on, but Roger was said to be cursed because he was born while it was still cancelled. So moving on from the curse and getting back to the main story now. Unfortunately for Castro, Lady Tichborne died in 1868, which greatly weakened his case and his wallet. This wasn't a big deal though, because his growing crowd of supporters replaced his allowance with a fund. Castro had gotten used to living the good life at this point, and his expensive habits quickly burnt through the money from his Tier 3 subs, leaving him broke within a couple of months. Since he needed the money, his lawyers came up with a plan. They basically created Tichborne V-Bucks, with each valued at £100. They also promised to pay holders back with interest when he got his inheritance. The scheme managed to raise about £40,000, but the V-Bucks very quickly became worthless and were traded for less and less. At this point, he was nearly out of money and desperate to claim his inheritance, so Castro went to court to establish his identity. If he could legally prove that he was Roger, he would immediately inherit the family's estates, which were bringing in just over £2 million per year. To sum up his defense in court, it was pretty weak. His lawyers said because of the shipwreck he had memory loss and could not remember information properly. They also blamed memory loss on him not knowing French or having an accent anymore. When asked who Arthur Orton is, his response was, "He's a large-boned man with sharp features, but he didn't want to go into any further detail because apparently he didn't want to incriminate himself. But he did say that Arthur Orton was his best friend. Then, his lawyers tried to argue it was irresponsible for the family to out him as Orton. One of his best witnesses was Roger's Batman, who vouched for his identity.
Aye, bruv, that's him, yeah?
Now, to sum up the prosecution, it was much stronger. They basically said the memory loss was a lame and easy-to-fake excuse. They also pointed out that he didn't know things that Roger should know, like he didn't know the difference between Greek and Latin, who Virgil was, or even what chemistry is. The claimant himself ended up pissing off pretty much everyone in court when he said he seduced Roger's cousin and former lover, Catherine Doughty. He made things even worse when he said that in the letter left to Godsford were instructions for handling Catherine's pregnancy. The lawyers also brought up his lack of accent, physical differences, and little recognition from close family. Then, the killing blow came when an old friend of Roger's testified that he had distinctive body tattoos, which the claimant did not have. Eventually, the jury decided they were ready to reject his case, and the judge ordered him to be arrested on charges of perjury. While in prison, he put out a message to the public begging for money, and since they loved him so much, the money started pouring in. When he was bailed out by Rivers and Onslow, a crowd gathered and cheered as he was released. But a year later, he was back in court for criminal charges, and this time it was even more one-sided. The prosecution called 215 witnesses who testified either that he was not Roger or he was Arthur. A handwriting expert was called in and matched the claimant's handwriting to Orton's, but found no resemblance to Roger's. Godsford was called in to show the contents of the letter, and in it, there was no mention of Catherine or a pregnancy. The defense mostly just cried conspiracy. His lawyer said the Catholic Church, government, and judicial system were all out to get him. They also called a witness named Louis to testify he had been aboard the alleged rescue boat that saved Roger, but it turns out the guy was just paid to lie, so Louis was then immediately thrown in jail for 7 years. So with all that said and done, the judge had no issues throwing out his case. He ruled that the claimant was not Roger, had not seduced Catherine, and was in fact Arthur Orton. He was then sentenced to 14 years in prison. Even though he was legally proven to be an imposter, a lot of people still supported him, and the entire time he was in prison, he maintained that he was Roger. But by the time he was released 10 years later, most people didn't care anymore. And on top of that, he disappointed the few people that did when he joined a circus instead of pursuing the case again. On his release, Orton had lost 150 pounds, and with no public interest in Britain anymore, he moved to New York where he worked as a bartender. He was so down bad at this point that in 1895, for a couple £100, he confessed in a newspaper that he actually was Arthur Orton. He then used the money to start a tobacco store and later take back his confession. Unfortunately for him though, his tobacco store kinda sucked, so he went out of business pretty quickly, and since he had no money left, he ended up being homeless. Being forced to live on the streets caused his health to decline quickly, and soon after, in 1898, he died of heart failure. 5,000 people attended his funeral in England, and in a very nice gesture, the Tichborne family allowed a plaque bearing Roger's name to be placed on his coffin. And with his death, the story of the Tichborne Claimant ends. Roger's body was never found, and some people still think the claimant could have been Roger. But before I end the video, I want to quickly go through some extra info about the case. I tried to cover as much of the story as I could, but I had to leave out quite a lot, so here's the list. Even though I made him look pretty dumb, the claimant was much smarter than I gave him credit for. He managed to fake his way into the British upper class, which is pretty impressive. Many people outside of the family met the claimant and thought he was pretty intelligent, including Mark Twain. During the second trial, there was issues brought up about the judge. Before being chosen for the case, the judge had already called out Orton for being a fake, and because of this, some people think he wasn't given a fair trial. Lastly, I did make fun of him for being much larger than Roger, but the two did somewhat look alike, so much so that there's theories of the Orton and Tichborne families being related. And that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any ideas for future videos, let me know in the comment section.